painting tutorial. Some time ago I was contacted on Facebook by a guy who had bought the game Sword and Sorcery for himself and his children. He was looking for someone to paint some of the included miniatures, so he asked if that someone would be me. I am always on the lookout for commissions, so I couldn't decline his request. So here I am with his miniatures arrived by mail. I don't know how many miniatures I'm going to be painting for him yet, so I cannot tell you how many Sword and Sorcery episodes I'll make just yet. I've looked over the miniatures and decided that I want to start with this Orc Warrior. I'll paint it in a classic green skin tone and also show you a method on how to add some blood splatter on the miniature. I'll start by undercoating the miniature in my personal go-to undercoat, Corax White. But first I would like to add a skull to his base, because you know what, I do like me some skulls. There we go. I'll be right back once I've undercoated the orc and the paint is dry. And here we are, the model has been undercoated. There were some places I had to undercoat it by hand because the spray couldn't quite reach all places, but here we are. I would like to start by painting the skin, and for that I'm using a base coat of warg flesh. I'll be using a approximately 1-to-1 mix of warg flesh and water. It is better to add 2 or 3 thin coats rather than one thick one. Well, let's get started. And now we just apply it all over the skin. So, the warg flesh is now dry. I ended up adding 2 layers of paint. Now I'd like to add some definition to the skin, so I'll add a shade of Beeltan green. I'll still use my regiment brush from the army painter. And with this we just add it all over. Make sure it runs into all the recesses and crevices. Just don't let it pool too heavily. Okay, I've given the shade plenty of time to dry, and you can see it has really added some definition to the model. If you just want a dark, mean looking orc to play with, you could stop right now, but I would like to take this much further. The next thing I'm going to do is add a layer of the aptly named Warboss Green. And what I'll do is I'll paint it on all the raised surfaces and avoid all the recesses. This time I think I'll take 2 drops of paint to 3 drops of water. I want this to be extra thin. So get paint on your brush. And like I said, avoid all the recesses, so you can see the muscles on his arm here. I'm just going to follow the muscle lines, like so. So you can still see the shape between the muscles. Do this all over the model. Okay, the layering is now complete, and as you can see it has made a great contrast between the shadows and the highlights. I want to take this a step further and add a Skarsnik green layer / highlight. And I'll paint at the same locations as before, but I'll try to remain within the lines I've just painted, so you can see the previous color next to it, like so. This will define the model even more. So once more, do this all over the model. Well, the paint is dry and he's green and he's mean. The final thing I want to do is add a final highlight, but this time by using a dry brush. Now remember, when dry brushing, it's important that you move the bristles back and forth quickly and against the muscles, for example, and not along them, because then you'll get paint into the recesses and we don't want that. So let's begin. Wipe out most of the paint on the tissue and we are ready to dry brush. And there we go, the skin is complete. Next I would like to paint the fur he wears around his waist. And for that I'm using a base coat of Mournfang Brown. Just be careful not to hit the skin. The paint is dry and I gave it 2 coats to get a smooth finish. Next I would like to add some shade to it, and I'm using Agrath Earth Shade. It took about 20 minutes for the shade to completely dry. Next I like to add a dry brush, a light dry brush of Deathclaw Brown. Once again, be careful not to hit the skin. And just carefully dry brush the raised edges. Following that, I'll add a very light dry brush of Tyrant Skull. Just very gently dry brush all over. And after that dry brush, the fur is complete. Next I would like to paint the little piece of cloth he has hanging over his fur, right here. I was thinking about doing it in a red color, but I think that would make him look like a Christmas tree, so avoid that. Then I thought about yellow, but yellow is close to green. So I'm going with a blue color, and for this I'm using a base coat of Caledor Sky. Just apply it very gently. We don't want to ruin our previous work. With that Caledor Sky applied, I'll add a shade of Dragonhof Nightshade. When the shade is dry, I'll add a layer of Techless Blue. I've added 1 drop of paint and 2 drops of water to the mix to make a smooth and thin transition. Just avoid the recesses. Following that, I'll grab my insane detail brush and add some Lordaeron blue as a highlight, such as on the edges of the cloth. And with that, the cloth is done. The next thing I would like to paint is all the metal. This is his weapons, his shield, the chain around him and so forth. I'm using a base coat of Lead Belcher. And as always, 2 thin coats are better than 1 thick one. With the lead belcher dry, it's time to add a shade, and I'm using Nuln Oil for this. "20 minutes has passed and the shade is now completely dry. The metal looks a bit dark though, so I'm going back to lead belcher and apply it once more, but this time as a layer, so essentially everything that is in a recess. So load up your brush and apply it once more to the metal areas. When the paint is dry, you can see we have a nice contrast between the recesses and the raised areas. I want to take this a bit further, so I'll add a highlight of Ironbreaker. What I'll do is I'll essentially paint all the raised areas and the places I want to look sharp, such as his axe. Like so. I've given all the metal an edge highlight of Ironbreaker, and now he almost looks like a knight in shining armor. It is very clean, and I want to change that, so I'm adding a shade of Agrath Earthshade to make it look a bit dirty. This is an orc after all. Just all over. The Agrath Earthshade is now dry and the metal looks proper nasty. You could call it finished by now, but I would like to add some rust to really make it look old and grimy. So what I'll do is I'll apply some Typhus Corrosion, which is a technical paint from Games Workshop. I wouldn't use my best brush on this one, however, because it's texture paint that can really ruin your brushes. So I got this old base coat brush. Just apply it wherever you want the rust to be. I'll use it straight from the pot. I'll add it, say, at the lower half of this axe. Like so. As you can see, it adds texture, which we can dry brush later. The Typhus Corrosion is dry, and I've added it to the lower part of this axe, as I said before, and the bottom part of the other axe, his knee pad and the pointy end of his shield. What we're going to do now is add a dry brush of Ryza Rust. And we're going to apply it over the Typhus Corrosion, so the texture will pick up the paint and give it a rusty effect. Like so. The more you dry brush, the more orange it will get, so it's up to you how rusty you want it to look. I like it a little bit subtle. Like so. I've added the rust effect to the model, and now there's only just one thing I would like to do to finish off the metal, and that is add a sporadic dry brush of Stormhost Silver. I want to make the appearance that there's actual metal under all that rust. I'll concentrate on the sharp edges. Like so. And there we are, the rust is finished. Now his shield got this sword embedded into it, and I think I would like to paint it in a bronze color, so I'll add a base coat of Screaming Bell. Following that, I'll apply a shade of Raglan Flesh Shade, very carefully so it doesn't run into the metal. I just want to add a little definition. Next, I'll add a layer of hashed copper, avoiding all the recesses. And lastly, I'll add a highlight of Sycorax Bronze. I'll just put a little paint on my brush and just follow the line down the center. Nice and easy. The sword is complete. And for my next magic trick, I like to paint the handle on the axe. And for that, I'm using a base coat of Dryad Bark. Just apply it in a thin layer all over. When the paint is dry, it's time to add a shade of Agrath Earthshade. When the shade is completely dry, I'll add a dry brush of Gawthor Brown. And once again, be careful not to hit the skin or the metal. I think the wood looks good already, but I would like to add a final dry brush of Baneblade Brown, just very lightly, especially at the edge of the handle. The wood is now, well, woody. The next area I'm going to paint is a large one that we cannot avoid any longer, and it's all the leather. And for that I'm using a base coat of Rhinox hide. And as always, thin layers are better than thick ones. Just apply it all over the leather. Well, the base coat is complete, and I must admit this took me a while. But it is important to remember that it's okay to take breaks and step away from it for a while. On the shield I had to use my insane detail brush to avoid getting the brown color on the metal. Next up is to add a shade, and I'm using Agrath Earthshade. Once more, just apply it all over the leather. When the shade is completely dry, it's time to add a layer. I am using a Doombull Brown, and I added 2 drops of paint to 3 drops of water. Now remember, when layering, it's important that you avoid all the recesses and crevices, and only focus on mostly flat areas and such. Well, let's begin. I've finished the layering, and I think it really starts to look like leather. There's only one more step I would like to do, and that is to add a highlight, an edge highlight of Tusk fur. I'll just follow any edges I see on the leather. Like here. Following that highlight, the leather is complete. Well, there are some stitches, but I'll paint those later. For now, I'll look at the bandages on his left arm. And for that, I'm going to use a base coat of Ushabti bone. With the base coat dry, I'll add a shade of Raglan Flesh Shade. It took about 20 minutes for the shade to completely dry. Now I'll finish the bandages by adding a dry brush of Screaming Skull. When you're happy with the result, it's time to paint the teeth, or tusk rather. And for that I'm going back to Ushabti bone. Following that, I'll add a highlight with Screaming Skull, just at the very tip of the tusk. When that's done, it's time to paint all the stitches. Just take your time, look all over the model, there are stitches literally everywhere. So I'm taking my Screaming Skull and just carefully paint all the stitches. So far, so good. Now it's time to paint the base, and I'll start by painting the skull I glued to the base. I'm giving it a base coat of Sandry Dust. Just paint it all over the skull. When the skull is dry, I'll add a shade of Seraphim Sepia. Once more, just all over the skull. When the shade is dry, I'll add a dry brush of Terminator Stone. Now the skull looks menacing. The next thing I want to do is paint the entirety of the base in Abaddon Black, and that includes the rim. Just be careful not to hit the legs of the skull. Right, so the base has been painted black. The look I'm going for is, I don't know, I'm not sure what to call it. Dark gravel, maybe ash. This is what I'm going for. I'm not sure what to call it, but I think it looks good. So the next step is to add a thick layer of mordant earth. This thing takes several hours to dry, so I recommend that you leave it overnight. Good morning YouTube. It's only been a few seconds for you, but it's been about 14 hours for me. And as you can see, the paint has cracked nicely. The next thing I want to do is add some astrogranite in various locations. Just a little bit around the base. For example, where the cracks are small, I'll cover it with astrogranite. I'll use an old brush for this. like that. And when you're satisfied, then give it around 30 minutes to dry. The astral granite is now dry, and now I want to paint it over with Abaddon black. Next, I'll shade the entire base with Nuln Oil. I've given the Nuln Oil about 20 minutes to dry. Next, I'll add a heavy dry brush of Dawnstone. Once more, all over the base. And finally, I'll add a dry brush of Rag White, just very lightly. The base and the model are essentially finished now. All I want to do now is add a varnish. And for this I'm using Ultra Varnish Matte from AK Interactive. However, it is quite strong, so I'm mixing it up with a little contrast medium. About a 1-to-1 mix. And I'll varnish everything except all the metal, because it kills the shine of it. As I said, just apply it everywhere and give it about 20, maybe 30 minutes to dry. The varnish is dry and the model is ready to see some action on the tabletop. The very last thing I want to do with this model is add some blood. And the reason I'm doing this after the varnish is because the varnish will ruin the blood effect if it's painted over it. So what I'm going to do is I'll use some blood for the blood guard and dry brush it lightly on this axe. That's the first step anyway. Just add it gently until you are happy with the result. And remember to do both sides of the axe. I've finished dry brushing the blood on and I think I like it. It's a little subtle, but it looks good. Now I want to add some blood splatter on the orc, and for that I'm using a toothpick. And I'll demonstrate it just before I paint it. I'll hold out the toothpick in front of the model, add a lot of blood of the blood guard on my dry brush, and then splatter it on. Like so, dry brushing the toothpick essentially, so the blood will splatter onto the orc. Let's give it a try. Just as before, continue until you're satisfied. And there we have it, the miniature is complete. I hope my client would like it, but I also hope that you, my dear viewer, like the painting process. If you are following along at home, then please share your work with the hashtag #JimmyStender on Instagram so I can check it out for myself. The quality of these models are very different from Games Workshop, which I am used to painting. These miniatures are way softer and thus easy to bend. They remind me a little of children's toys. But I like the sculpt and I hope that I'll be painting more of these in the future. With that said, thank you for watching, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Happy painting!